Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective here. Today I'm going to be talking more about the New American Standard Bible, the NASB. The NASB is a very interesting translation. It has a lot of people that really like it. The people who like it seem to be really gung-ho about it. But it's going through some interesting developments right now, which make for some very interesting conversations. And the NASB Bible translation is going to be having an update called the NASB2020. There was another update announced that I've talked about called the Legacy Standard Bible. And then there's the NASB that many people have used for now quite a long time, the NASB95. So when you put that all together, there are like 3 NASBs that are going to be out in the next couple years. So the question is that too many? That's what we're going to be talking about today from A Frisch Perspective. So the NASB is a translation that I've talked about before, and it's not really my favorite Bible translation. I have other ones that I prefer more, but I do find the NASB very fascinating because it's known for being the most literal English translation. So I think that's one reason people are drawn to it. It's advertised, it's promoted as being very literal. People that are really studious and really like to do biblical studies of biblical languages tend to like the NASB. It just kind of has that reputation for being scholarly, but it has such an interesting background and history to it. And now with the multiple updates that are coming with the NASB 2020 and the Legacy Standard Bible that's going to be put out by Master's College and Seminary, John MacArthur. So that's really fascinating that you have, already the NASB, the people who love the 95, and then these updates that are coming. So it's making for some interesting conversation. Now, for those of you who don't know, the NASB has its own unique history. It came from the American Standard Version. So that's why it's called the New American Standard, because the American Standard Version was the older version. And the American Standard Version came out in 1901, and that was essentially a revision of the King James Version with a critical textual basis behind the American Standard Version and trying to update the scholarship and some of the wording. It was known, though, the American Standard Version was known for being very literal. So right off the bat, the background of the NASB is it has a literal basis in the American Standard Version of 1901. Then the New American Standard Bible came around, I think in the 1960s is when it was developed and came out. And a very well-known version of the New American Standard Bible was the 1977 update. And so it was just known for being very literal. And It had its people that used it. I know I've heard people even on this channel comment that they've used the NASB for years and years and years. But then it was updated in 1995. And I think it maintained a real good amount of use among certain people in evangelical Christianity. But I have heard that the ESV, the English Standard Version, which came along in 2001, kind of displaced the New American Standard Bible. And you can see that actually among many evangelical Christians, because if you really look statistically, since 2001, a lot of people have used the English Standard Version and continue to do so. So it's very interesting, and they actually do have some similar backgrounds to them. The American Standard Bible became also the basis for the Revised Standard Version, which is essentially where the English Standard Version comes from. So they really actually have similar lineage. But the English Standard Version, I think there are just things about it that made it more popular. Certainly Crossway, the publisher of the ESV, did a great job putting it out there, making it available, and promoting it in just, really effective ways. So the ESV has done well. And I would actually say among the more conservative-minded, the ESV is probably number one, other than obviously the King James and the New King James continue to be very popular among, again, the most conservative evangelicals. Now, fundamentalists, people that, get into more, those territories would still use the King James a lot. But then you also have a lot of evangelicals who use the New International Version. And that actually is extremely popular and has been since it came out in the late 70s, and a very popular version from 1984, the NIV 1984, has been around and used a long time. And then even the most recent update of the New International Version in 2011, still very popular. So, here's the point I'm making in all this. There's a lot of things happening in the Bible translation world. There are a lot of new translations. You have the ESV that came along. You have new translations like the Christian Standard Bible. And so you get these new translations. You also have updates of existing translations like the NIV. So the market for Bibles and the market share, the amount of people that are out there that are potential consumers for these translations, there's only so many people that are going to buy Bibles, and so there's a lot of competition going on. You have that. You also have just the philosophy of each company and each group that puts out each translation, and you have the changing world. The culture changes, the language changes, all of that. And that's why you see updates to translations. Now, the New American Standard Bible is not new to updates. As I said, it started in the 60s. It was updated in 1977, another update in 1995. It's not really surprising that the New American Standard Bible is doing another update. And with each one, they've really tried to make the language more up to date to the way that we speak today. So in 1977, it still had some of the feel of the American Standard Version. It was literal, but it had some more older formalized English in certain places. Then the NASB95 was still literal, and it's still known for being literal, but they definitely tweaked it more, updated the language, possibly made it less literal in the text and put some of those literal renderings in the footnotes. I'm not super familiar with all the changes that I made, but that's just the sense I get, is that the 95 probably isn't quite as literal as its predecessor, but still very literal and definitely updated language. And then the NASB 2020 just continues that trend. It's actually going to be more updated language. Actually, one of the things that's really, met with various reactions is, what do you do with gender? And the NASB 2020, just to clarify this, it is going to try to be gender accurate in certain ways. I don't think they'll take that to an extreme. But for example, when you do see that word for brothers, and a New Testament writer is talking to the church and says brothers, and they're referring really to men and women, the NASB 2020, from what I understand, is going to do something really interesting. They are going to put brothers and sisters so that English readers know that's talking about men and women. But sisters they're going to put in italics, which in the New American Standard Bible designates that these are supplied words in English. They're not the literal word of the original language. I think that's a really good way to do it, actually. But I understand why some people don't like that, because people who use the New American Standard Bible really do tend to like the more traditional ways of rendering things. And they tend to be people more wary of cultural trends. So translating it brothers and sisters, even if you use italics, to some people just feels like that's catering to a cultural trend. You can watch my last video where I talk about the issue of masculine terminology and why I prefer it in a generic sense. But I think honestly to translate it brothers and sisters, if you put a footnote or if you put sisters in italics, I don't really have a major problem with that. My only thing is, if the NASB is supposed to be this literal translation, then why not keep those things in a very literal way? Because you have other translations that are going to be more, gender accurate. So I think for the New American Standard Bible, it kind of makes sense to stay with the more literal renderings. However, again, there is a market competition here with Bibles. And what good is it to put a Bible out there that, so many people ultimately aren't going to use? Now, it's fascinating with the New American Standard Bible because people who like it and do use it, as I've said, are pretty gung-ho about it. So I think, with the New American Standard Bible, it becomes one of those things where because it's unique, it has a really strong following. So by making it less unique, you're going to make maybe less passionate followers. However, it's going to become more widely used. If you make certain kinds of changes, it could become more mainstream than it is right now. I think that's part of the reasoning. But also I think the reasoning too is they want to make it as understandable to present day readers as possible. So you've got the NASB77, the NASB95, the NASB2020, and then the Legacy Standard Bible, which is going to be produced by Masters Seminary and College and John MacArthur's group. They are basically going to take the New American Standard 95, I assume, and tweak it, modify it to their specifications. They want it to be, I think, more consistent in word usage, so that if you translate an original language word into English with this one word, you're going to try to use that same word as much as possible. And they're also going to change some of the terminology, especially for the word God or the name of God. Instead of putting capital Lord, which is traditional, they're going to render that as, I assume, Yahweh. It's interesting because the American Standard Version, which is what the New American Standard Bible came from, did render the name of God as a name. It didn't use Lord all the time in the Old Testament. It used Jehovah. So I think the Legacy Standard Bible is in some ways harking back to that policy or way of going about Bible translation from the original American Standard Version. But I don't think they're going to use Jehovah. For various reasons. I would think they would use Yahweh. That is a whole different subject, but that's what I understand they would translate the name of God as. So I have heard different people react differently. I thought it would be good actually to just show some examples of what I'm talking about with the different New American Standard Bibles, but it is interesting to hear people's reaction and how some people are going to stick with the New American Standard 95. Some people are definitely on board with the New American Standard 2020. They're fine with it. And then other people are really intrigued by the Legacy Standard Bible, and they're drawn to that. And I think maybe there's too many New American Standard Bibles to choose from. But it'd be interesting just to take a look at some comparisons here of the New American Standard Bible. So let's do that. And I want to look first at Psalm 23. This on the left here is the New American Standard Bible 1977. On the right is the 1995 edition. What is interesting is these are very similar. Psalm 23 uses very similar language in the New American Standard to the King James Version. It's a little bit updated. But if you look at it, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. They look pretty much the same here as each other until you get to language addressing God directly. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou dost prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. In the 95 update of the New American Standard Bible, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. So you get the idea when you're comparing the New American 77 with the 95. The New American Standard in 1977 still had these and thous when referring to God directly if you were addressing God. So some of that more traditional formal language that you get carrying over from older English, which you see a lot in the King James Version. Both of these, though, do retain kind of a King James feel to them. And it's interesting when you get to the New American Standard Bible 2020. I'll show you a comparison of that with the 95. And what you see here is that the NASB95 of Psalm 23 compared to the 2020, it moves away from a King James wording of things. So instead of the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, it says the Lord is my shepherd, I will not be in need. He makes me lie down in green pastures becomes he lets me lie down in green pastures. And then at the end of verse 3, he guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake becomes he guides me in the paths of righteousness for the sake of his name. And then down in verse 6, some other changes. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Becomes certainly goodness and faithfulness will follow me all the days of my life, and my dwelling will be in the house of the Lord forever. So again, what I see changing there some is really just getting away from more traditional wordings. You know, it's interesting, in the King James Version of Psalm 23:1, it did say, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, which is what you really see in the New American Standard Bible all the way up through the 95 edition. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. However, what does that really mean? I was researching this a little bit, and the New International Version from 84 still tried to use the word want. I think it said, I shall not be in want. But the latest edition of the NIV says something more like, I will not be in need, or I'll have everything that I need. Something more along those lines. And the NASB is doing the same thing here. I will not be in need. So I think what you're seeing in all of this is really just a moving away from the King James wording that you traditionally had. Obviously, the King James had a great influence, and translations were heavily influenced by the King James. Even the New International Version was influenced by the King James Version. But translations are definitely moving away from the wording of the King James. And it's actually a long-time trend that already in the 1800s you could see a move away from the King James and being very rigidly attached to it. The Webster Bible, I talked about this recently. Noah Webster felt like the King James needed to be updated some in his day in 1833. So it's a long time thing that the King James has been, becoming less and less current in its usage. That being said, people still love the King James. I'm very attached to the King James in a lot of ways, but newer translations and updates of translations are feeling the need more and more to move away from the King James wording. So that's one that I have on all of this is just noticing that trend in the New American Standard Bible 2020 away from King James wording, and you could see that in Psalm 23. Now, I did forget to point out that at the beginning of that psalm, it actually says there, Lord is my shepherd, instead of the Lord is my shepherd. So that is a very unusual thing, and I don't know if they're going to really word it that way, Lord is my shepherd. It seems like if you're not going to have the article the, it might be better to actually translate as the name of God there and put Yahweh is my shepherd. But we'll see what the NASB 2020 actually does with that. But again, they're just moving away from King James wording in Psalm 23. Now, personally for me, I know, when you hear me talk about all this, you have your own opinions. Some people have very strong opinions. I like having a traditional translation like the King James and the New King James. I love to use those. And then I also like to have a modern translation, like the Christian Standard Bible, for example, is one of the ones I really like. I like that fresh translation as long as it's still trying to be accurate to the original languages. So when you put the two together, I think it's a good balance. But there's no doubt about it. I still personally love the tradition of the King James. I think it has great heritage, beautiful wording that's just shaped our English language for centuries. But I still appreciate modern translations, so I tend to go with one or the other. The New American Standard Bible and the English Standard Version are more hybrid. They're new in some ways, and yet they're still tied into the King James. I'm more all or nothing. I either want the King James, New King James, or I want something really fresh and current. That just tends to be my way of thinking about it. Although I appreciate the New American Standard and the English Standard. They each have their advantages too. But I like the King James along with a more modern translation. And then I would also say that when you really look at all this together, when you really put it all together, this is a very important thing to realize, is that, yes, there are a lot of translations, and some have said too many English translations. I tend to agree with that. But I will say this, I know it can be overwhelming, but at the end of the day, they're actually very similar. I compared, many translations on Bible Gateway. You can do that, take a verse and compare many English translations, and what you'll see is they're actually very similar. So really having all these translations, it's really more than necessary in some ways, because they're actually very similar to each other. And there's certainly no reason for us to be judgmental and be so suspicious of other Christians because of what translation they happen to use. Obviously, if it's a translation that in some way is truly heretical, if it's put out by a cult group or something like that, yeah, we need to be wary of that. But most of the translations that are available are really, very similar in many ways, and are put together by people that really have a high regard for the Word of God. So because of that, I think we can overstate the differences of translations, when in reality, they're actually very similar in many ways. That being said, to kind of sum up all this, if we have this many New American Standard Bibles, we have all these other English translations, it just kind of makes me feel sometimes like I really wish we could have a standard Bible that we all, tend to use. That would be nice. There are some languages that only have one Bible translation, and many languages don't even have one, which is really sad to think about. It should really cause us as English speakers, English Christians, to really be grateful for the translations that we have, but also to really be careful about our mindset, and just to be mindful of how so much of the world doesn't have access to the Word of God the way that we do. And I think that should give us pause. I do wish, though, again, that we had one translation that was more of a unifying translation for us. That was nice when the King James was used so universally in the English-speaking world. But there were various reasons why that was so. Obviously, the King James Version came from England. England had a lot of influence in the world during the couple hundred years that the King James was highly influential. So you can see why the King James was so widely used. But the New International Version is certainly extremely popular. I have to be honest and say whether that is a translation that a lot of the viewers of this channel like or read a lot or not, the New International Version clearly is a widely used translation. So in some ways you just have to say, okay, if that's the one many people are using, then in some ways you have to just admit that is kind of the main translation of many evangelical Christians today. I know there are people who maybe don't prefer that, but that is a reality. But all that being said, I mean, it would be nice. I feel like all of us, if we were able to be in charge, we would say, okay, I wish most Christians would just use this particular translation. But there are reasons why we have differences of opinion on it. And so those are some of my opinions. And I would love to hear your thoughts on all of this. But those are just some things I wanted to talk about on the subject of the New American Standard Bible and whether there are too many NASBs. Thank you for listening to my thoughts from A Frisch Perspective.